right, so recording has begun. Everybody feeling good? All right, so we're at 2 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the broadcast and do that announcement, and then we'll get started shortly after. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We are going to give everyone just about a minute or so, a little bit of time to join the webinar. I'm looking right now, and it looks like a number of people are coming in. So we're just going to give it about another minute or so before we get started. So just please hang tight, if you will. While we're waiting, if you would, go to your chat feature and just enter in where you're joining us from today so we can get an idea of who our audience is and where everyone is joining. And then, as I said, we're going to go ahead and get started here shortly. All right, excellent. We've got great representation. Thank you all for entering. We've got people from Erie, Pennsylvania, St. Louis, Nebraska, Sioux City, Iowa, Pittsburgh, Colorado, a couple of individuals from Colorado, New York, Canada, welcome, Charlotte, Harrisonburg, Virginia, Northwest Arkansas, lots of great representation. So with that, we are going to go ahead and officially get started. Again, thank you all for joining today. My name is Anthony Salas, and I am the Event and Membership Manager with Welcoming America. And on behalf of all of us at Welcoming America, I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar today. Very timely, I think, webinar on how communication can divide and unite, addressing hate and division in the time of COVID-19. So as many of you know, we always try to make sure that we're providing you with the information and content that supports all of the great work that you are doing out across the country. And these webinars are just one small way that we do that. So if you haven't already, I do invite you to go to our resources page. You can go to welcomingamerica.org/resources and use the search function there. You can search for information by keyword, and anything that we have related to that will come up there, including toolkits, blog posts, webinars, things like that. So definitely take some time to visit our resources page. And as you know too, we have this COVID webinar series that we have been hosting for the last few weeks. And we do have a couple others that are coming up after this week's. We've got on April 30th, a webinar on supporting immigrant-owned small businesses during the pandemic. I will note on that one, the time is different. It will be at 12:30 Eastern Time, 11:30 Central, and it will be for 90 minutes. So hopefully you can join us for that. And then on May 7th, we'll revert back to our 2 o'clock Eastern Time. That webinar will be introducing virtual civic dinners to help build community and social cohesion in times of crisis. So that'll be a really great conversation about how we can all be creative with our new virtual reality that we're all using right now. For today's presentation, very excited to have a wonderful group of individuals joining us here today. From Over Zero, we are being joined by Rachel Brown, who is the founder and executive director, as well as Samantha Owens, who is the Regional Director for the US region. So we're excited to hear from both of them. And then in addition to them, we are being joined by some wonderful members of our welcoming network. We're being joined by Nichole Rouached, who is the Manager of Communications and Projects with OrthoWorx. Natalie Ringsmuth, who is the Founder and Director of Unite Cloud. And Xiao, who is the Director with the Salt Lake County Mayor's Office for New Americans. We are very excited to have everyone joining to present to you today. As a reminder, if you've got any questions as the presentation goes on, please use that chat feature where you entered your information on the location that you're joining from. Enter your question there at any time. We're going to be keeping an eye on that, and we'll be addressing questions at the end of the formal presentation. So with that up, I'm not going to go to questions yet. I am going to go ahead and turn things over to Rachel, who's going to start today's presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, and we are really excited to be here and share some thinking with you all. Over Zero is an organization that works on preventing and creating resilience to identity-based violence. And we're specifically focused on how groups are targeted with violence based on their identity and what we can do to push back. And our really core area of focus and expertise is on the use of communication, both to stoke division and how we can leverage the very powerful and transformative nature of communication to instead walk societies on a different path towards inclusion, towards belonging. And so COVID-19, the health and economic crises it creates, create new challenges in this domain. And what we're going to do today is share with you some of our high-level takeaways, both on the new risks that are created, the way that COVID-19 contributes to existing risks, and what we can do about it. In this moment, I'll turn over to Samantha to talk about risks, but I do want to note that we'll be able to share an annotated version of this PowerPoint, and next week we'll be releasing a longer guide that has a lot of this content, but in more detail with partners, and we'll be sure to make that available to this network. To Samantha.
So throughout human history, outbreaks of disease, epidemics, pandemics have triggered and accelerated division, hate, and violence. And unfortunately, as we've seen, COVID-19 is no different. We'll be going through the dynamics. As Rachel said, our focus is on the dynamics of communication, identity-based violence. So before we dive in, first, I'll define what we mean by communication. So communication, in our definition, is an exchange of information, any exchange of information. It can be a gesture, an image, an action, and it's a fundamental part of what it means to be human. It's how people make sense of the world, create a collective reality, find belonging, understand norms. And when we're referring to communication, we're not referring only to the message itself, but also the structure and process by which it takes place. So the infrastructure of communication, who the messengers are, how it's interpreted, what the different channels are. And when looking at communication that can increase the likelihood of identity-based violence, group-targeted harm, we're looking at impact over intent. So what that means is, while some hateful messages may carry harm in and of themselves, they may not mobilize for action. And some messages that are quite dangerous may not be hateful in intent, and we'll see examples of those, particularly messages such as we have to protect our vulnerable, we have to protect women and children. So when looking at narratives around pandemics and disease that are dangerous, we've seen this play out time and time again in the US. particularly targeting minorities, and among those, particularly targeting new Americans. So we've seen the Irish associated with cholera in the late 19th century. Jews in the late 19th and early 20th century were associated with tuberculosis, to the extent that it was referred to as the Taylor's disease in reference to Jewish-owned garment businesses in New York's Lower East Side, and was central to xenophobic, anti-Semitic rhetoric around this time. We've seen this more recently in the early days of the AIDS epidemic with Haitians. In the 1980s, early 1990s, Haitians were targeted as carriers of the disease. Again, to the extent that after a coup in Haiti in 1991, 200 Haitians who had been approved for asylum but tested positive for HIV, or had a family member test positive for HIV, were imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay. We've also seen this with Mexicans with typhus in the early 20th century. And unfortunately, we see these dynamics playing out now. I'm sure a dozen examples are coming to everyone's mind, but a few that have stood out to us are references to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. Similarly, online conspiracy theories linking the outbreak of COVID-19 to powerful Jews, to a plot or larger conspiracy of powerful Jews and the Chinese. Some fringe and some prominent figures also now claiming that COVID-19 is a punishment for homosexuality and same-sex marriage. And we also see narratives of blame being used to frame the disproportionate number of COVID-19 fatalities among African Americans as some sort of personal, moral, or community failure. So these dynamics are alarming. Amidst these dynamics, however, there are also opportunities for leaders to foster cooperation and inclusion. So today, first, we'll be going through the risks. We'll talk about those dynamics that I just gave examples of, and then we will move into strategies for not only countering these risks, but building more inclusive, more cooperative, more just communities. So what are the risks in this moment? So first, the first of these risks is that narratives portray minority groups, particularly those that have been historically marginalized, as threats. So COVID-19 poses universal health and economic threats, though their impact will be felt differently by different segments of society. And threat changes dynamic between groups. If everyone sees themselves as facing a common threat, they can become more united. But if people see members of another group as a threat, they may be more likely to accept violence or discrimination against that group. So in this context, common ideas and narratives that are used to justify violence or other forms of harm gain power, they gain traction. The pandemic has the potential to feed narratives of blame, of threat, of dehumanization. And these narratives blame minority groups for the disease and for the economic fallout and portray them as a threat to the dominant group. And that threat can be real, it can be symbolic, it can be, when I say real, I mean like threat to physical security. When I say symbolic, I mean threat to way of life, to values. And these narratives, again, rely very heavily on dehumanization a lot of the time. So portraying groups as less than human, such as metaphors comparing them to pests, to rodents, other animals. Disease obviously plays a big role here, and the sort of disgust response that goes along with descriptions of disease. And then once these narratives gain traction, the second risk here is that us versus them mentalities take hold and fuel animosity toward the other. So as threats of disease, are coupled with a scarcity mindset, such as medical shortages, food shortages, lack of jobs, competition for resources can also fuel anger toward other groups. Thus, as people turn to their respective identity groups for protection and security, social identities become more singular and rigid, and suspicions of the other begin to arise or get stronger. This can create new fault lines where none had previously existed, but it can also exacerbate existing us versus them dynamics. And this can also make people feel more pressure to go along with the group in these times of uncertainty and anxiety, given the greater need for protection and belonging, and people looking for a sense of safety. So when this happens, discrimination, exclusion, and violence are portrayed as the only option to protect the us or to right wrongs committed against the group. So members of a targeted group are portrayed as a monolith, as one entity, and they're all the same in their essence. As a monolith, they're often described as guilty, so they've committed some sort of wrong against our group, or threatening, and again, those threats can be against more physical threats, such as a physical attack or disease, or they can be symbolic, power, way of life, and they're also again portrayed as somehow different in their essence, and again with that dehumanization, comparisons to vermin, disease, pestilence, things that get a really visceral disgust response. And then coupled with this violent action toward the them being seen as the only option, such actions may also be portrayed as heroic. The people willing to commit violence or harm are glorified, while those speaking up against them are portrayed as weak or traitorous. So social or political solutions to the problem are depicted as unfeasible or ineffective, and violence thus becomes violence and discrimination and other types of targeted harm become painted as the only possible course of action. And this is also often tied to ideas of masculinity and what it means to be a good man willing to protect the group. And finally, in this scenario, even empathy is used to justify harm. Again, calling for the need to be a protector, the need to be a good group member and a protector of, in particular, women and children tend to be weaponized here. So what's critical here is the allocation of empathy. So it's not about how much empathy someone has, it's about how it's distributed. So if it's distributed evenly across society, it can motivate people to come together and help one another. Whereas if it's focused only on one's own group, it can lead people to take protective actions on behalf of their own group. And beyond that, even if empathy is felt for other groups, even if there is some level of distribution, it can be superseded by feelings of fear, disgust, and anxiety that override those feelings of empathy. And I'll turn it over to Rachel at this point.
So in this environment, we have these sort of hardened us-them divisions that get created. As Sam described, threat gets activated. People have this tendency to close ranks around a group, and then harm against other groups, whether that's exclusion, discrimination, or violence, is justified as the only means to sort of protect, quote unquote, us against an external threat. And these are the common narratives that we see that are used to justify the targeting of groups. And as Sam has illustrated, they can be very exacerbated in a context where there is an actual threat of a disease and an economic crisis, when the blame for that threat gets tied together with a group that's being targeted. But there are things that we can do. It's important that we understand this context in order to understand where we can intervene. One of the most critical things here is to reaffirm unifying identities and to set positive norms. This is important because where us-them divides are being created, we need to sort of break them down and reassert a different version of we. So how is the us being defined? Who is it that deserves protection? What we're facing here is a very narrow and exclusive idea of the us that deserves protection from an other. And so it's really important in this moment that we think about how are we defining the we. This is one of the most powerful things that we can do, is to define a broad, inclusive, and diverse us or a we, to show interdependence, to show common goals and aspirations in the face of the threat of a pandemic and of an economic crisis. And the ways that you can operationalize something like this is actually not to talk about us and them at all. It's just to show images and actions of people doing things together, people meeting their needs and their goals and their aspirations together under common banners. So you could do this by showcasing the identity of a town. If you're in Akron, Ohio, is it Akronites Unite, right? And it's people of all different diverse backgrounds working together under this common group identity of being from Akron to support each other. Is it mothers facing COVID together? And what you're showing, you're not talking about any dividing identities. You're just talking about that unifying identity and showing a diverse set of people that are showing up to each other under that common banner. This takes us out of the divisive us-them frame, and it makes it harder for people to activate identities in divisive ways. It's also really important to set strong and positive norms through both communication and through modeling actions. Norms are sort of these informal, unwritten rules that dictate how we act and behave. I always think of middle schoolers in a cafeteria and how you want to act, dress, like the same music as your friends. All the research shows us that the norms that we perceive, what we think all or most of our peers are doing or approve or disapprove of, is one of the strongest forces to influence our actions, sometimes more than even our individual beliefs, and often more actually than our beliefs. And so it's really important that in this moment, we think not just about how to shape people's hearts and minds, but we also think about how do we set positive norms in this moment? How do we draw important red lines in the sand about what is and isn't appropriate behavior, narratives to be using, information to be spreading, but also show people models for how they're expected to behave. And so to do this, if you're a leader, right, it's also about modeling your actions and sharing your stories to your network. I did this the other day. A lot of norms stem from who the messengers are. People look to sort of key leaders and figures in their community, whether that's in their sector, whether that's sort of the friend group that they're with, whether that's their faith leader or lay leaders, business leaders in their community. You all probably know who are the people in your communities that are the norm setters. The way those people act and speak right now is going to be really critical. And so ways to set positive norms include sort of, and tying back to this we identity, showing those figures embracing a diverse and inclusive we, showing them cooperating amongst diverse groups and taking action together. So you're setting norms of inclusion. We're all on the same team here. You're setting norms of cooperation. Look at these diverse groups in our community working together. And you're also showing this sense of collective agency, that when we're coming together in this way, we're actually able to make it through this hard time. This is how we face the threats of COVID-19, of economic scarcity, is that we do it together. And so these are two really critical things. They don't speak directly to immigration. They don't speak directly to this group or that group. They actually, again, redefine that collective we, but also define norms and expectations for how people should behave. One last and really critical thing about norms and norm setting is that when bad things are happening, they can often gain traction when we accidentally give them too much oxygen and let them set a norm. So we see this a lot when it comes to combating hate. And we see this across a range of negative behaviors. People have a tendency to overestimate the prevalence of negative behaviors in their community. So on college campuses, for example, students will overestimate the percentage of their peers who are binge drinking. And this is pretty constant because negative behaviors might get more attention, more light shed on them. One of the best interventions to reduce binge drinking on college campuses has been shown to be actually correcting that misperception, showing people your peers aren't binge drinking as much as you think they are. Similar findings for things from energy usage to paying your tax on time. So what does this have to do with hate and COVID-19? Often loud voices promoting hate, promoting these narratives that, that claim that entire groups of people are to blame for some sort of economic downturn, disease, pose a threat, they can gain a lot of limelight. They can be very loud. And in doing so, they make other people think that that's the norm, that other people will believe those narratives, and then it becomes much harder for people to speak out against the norm. So what's really critical is that when we bring attention to hate, when we bring attention to a spike in bias incidents or hate crimes or these narratives, we do so in a way that simultaneously shows that it's not the norm. Most people in our community see themselves as part of this community and are working together to get through it and don't approve of this type of language, but a few people are doing it, and we're seeing them engage more, and most people are standing up to condemn these actions. So you simultaneously, while shedding light on the problem, is there a spike in hate crimes? Most people disapprove of this. Most people are coming together to reach out to their neighbors and say, how can we support you in this moment? The framing of that messaging and the showing the positive norm alongside bringing attention to the problem is really critical to prevent a negative norm from inadvertently being promoted and further emboldening these negative narratives. It's also really critical that we think about messages that resonate with people while undercutting harmful narratives, some of the harmful narratives that we just talked about. Metaphors are a really critical part of how we speak and communicate. We are using them all the time, sometimes without even thinking about it or noticing. And we use them especially to explain really complex things. And so we see a lot of metaphors being used to describe disease and to describe how it spreads. Some of these metaphors can be helpful. Others can be very harmful and can feed harmful narratives. And what research has shown is that metaphors can prime people to feel fear and anger and suspicion of the other. And some of the types of metaphors that are commonly used around disease and that we were seeing being used around COVID-19 are biomilitary metaphors and criminality metaphors. So biomilitary metaphors portray us as being sort of at war. So the disease is a war enemy, and we're battling a disease. We're going to war with the disease. The problem with that metaphor is it becomes easy to transfer the idea of a wartime enemy from the disease itself to a group of people or the people who might be infected with the disease. And when that happens, it feeds directly into that threat from blame narrative that we talked about. The same goes for criminality metaphors. This disease is stealing our future and it's lurking around corners, and it's, you know, all of those metaphors. Likewise, in painting the disease as criminal, you can imagine how that starts to be transferred to people that are infected with the disease. And when that gets bundled together to target a minority group, it's really, really problematic. And so at the same time, we can think about what are metaphors that would help people see themselves as in it together and able to effectively manage what's in front of them. So some researchers, for example, have talked about using public safety metaphors. So I can buckle my seatbelt and that helps keep me safe from a car accident. I can also wash my hands. So finding the metaphors that give agency and let people see how they can cooperate together can also be really helpful. I think that this is a moment when people are feeling a lot of different things, and there's often the desire to promote empathy as an emotion that could be helpful to motivate people towards helping actions. It's really important when we think about empathy that we're aware of how it can be weaponized. As Samantha described, empathy can be used to say if you care about, if you feel deep empathy for the vulnerable amongst our very exclusive, our own group, you'll be willing to harm those other people to protect us, to keep them out of the country, to give them second substandard care so that we can have the best care, right? So empathy can be used, if it's just empathy for quote unquote our own group, it can be used to justify a variety of actions that harm others in the name of that protection narrative. So we have to be really aware of thinking about how empathy gets distributed, and also that empathy often fails in the face of emotions like fear, stress, anxiety, right? It's an emotion that requires a level of emotional capacity and that we're not accessing when we feel feelings of fear and stress and anxiety. And it often loses out when it comes into competition with those emotions. So we have to really think hard about how and when we use empathy, and how we can turn it to action. So some best practices for activating empathy across group lines are actually combining this with some of the other recommendations that we talked about. So first, activating one of those common identities, right? Acronites unite, mothers facing COVID together, right? And then within that, showcasing stories of people under that common banner from diverse backgrounds. People are more likely to feel empathy for someone that they already feel that they're relating to, or share an identity with in some way. So that can be an opening, that can be a sort of a starting point for that journey of activating empathy across lines that are being activated for division. You can also use norms. You can set an example, or you can find key norm setters in your community who can set an example by sharing the story of how they felt empathy for others. It's interesting, but setting a norm of empathy can actually make people feel more empathy. So sharing, I was hearing this story, I was talking to this person, here's how I felt compassion for them as I was talking to them, and here's what I did about them. And you can describe the action that you took to, or have someone share a story of the action that they took from that empathy. And then finally, this is a moment where, like I said, we recognize everyone is struggling in one way or another. And in your communications, as all of us communicate with other people, starting those communications by being empathic, by acknowledging people, by asking about them, by showing compassion ourselves across dividing lines, can really help model that behavior, and can also build trust and relationship with the audiences that we're reaching. A next recommendation is on undermining stereotypes, right? There's a lot of different stereotypes, a lot of different narratives being newly activated about different groups that are being targeted right now. Often these stereotypes specifically try, and stereotypes and narratives about groups that cause harm or dehumanize, usually try and sort of take away the idea that a group has either warmth or competence. So when we think about people that we know and have empathy for and see as fully human, we imagine them as having a level of warmth. They care for others, they have a positive intention towards others, and a level of competence. They're able to act. They have complex emotions and feelings and ideas and thoughts, and they're very capable. When groups are dehumanized, even in very subtle ways, they're often shown as either lacking warmth, so they have a bad intention, they don't have emotions, they don't have compassion, or lacking competence. They can't even take care of themselves. They're dirty. They're not able to sort of to manage complex situations or even feel complex emotions. And so it's really important that for anyone who's in the position of telling stories about another group, especially a group that's being targeted, we see this sometimes in empathy narratives. People want to evoke empathy for a group, so they'll show someone, maybe a small child or something, with a lot of warmth, but not a lot of competence, or they'll show members of a group in really desperate situations to evoke empathy, but they won't show that people are actually complex and competent. It's really important to showcase both of those things when telling stories about other groups, to make sure that you're being careful not to show any group as lacking either warmth or competence. It can also be really tempting to tell stories of people who are exceptional, of people who sort of seem superhuman and are taking on superhuman feats. But it's also really important, the negative sort of underside of those narratives is that they can imply that people only deserve compassion or inclusion into a bigger we if they are exceptional, rather than if they're just a normal person who is sometimes helping others, sometimes suffering and receiving help, or whatever it might be. So it's really important that stories show people from all different groups who are experiencing a range of emotions, but are also just sort of pitching in the ways that they can, rather than only stories that are sort of these superhuman feats. There are many best practices when it comes to correcting mis and disinformation that can be used. I'll touch on them for 1 second here, and again, you'll have this slide deck, but some of the key things are to, of course, correct as quickly as possible, to use positive framing. I always think, I am not a crook, right? When we use a negative framing, when we put not in the correction to a piece of misinformation, we're actually increasing the association. I am not a crook. Now you see what you'll remember is the association between I and crook, right? Rather than the not piece. It's important not to repeat misinformation. And if you actually do have to repeat the misinformation, to correct it, to give a warning beforehand, to question the intention of the source, the motive of the person spreading the misinformation, rather than just the misinformation itself. And it's important not to just stop at correcting one particular rumor or piece of misinformation. Misinformation often fuels all those narratives we just talked about. So trying to find out why is this misinformation spreading? What is it that people believe that's causing them to believe this particular story or about a group? So finding out those deeper narratives that it's tapping into and addressing those. The last two pieces of sort of recommendations that we will highlight in this very broad overview for you all is that it's really important to think not just about the content of the message, but also of the messengers and channels. How is information being distributed? And the starting point is to think about who do you want to reach and who do they trust and how do they access information. And so a large part of using communication in a crisis or to combat hate is about finding those channels that will actually reach people and finding the messengers that they're actually listening to and working to cultivate those messengers and channels. So this can be a really important time to develop and build on your existing relationships with really key messengers in your own community, to work with them to ensure that they understand what are some of the more intuitive types of messaging that might accidentally signal a negative norm or feed into some of these harmful narratives, and that they can avoid those. And then the last thing that we wanted to highlight is that this is a long-term, preventing identity-based violence and targeting of groups for harm is a long-term challenge. And you all as part of this network obviously know this and have been working on it so extensively for so long. As we face this crisis, there's a really important question to be asked of where are there new relationships of trust that are forming in your community amidst COVID-19 that are helpful, that are cutting across existing divides because people are helping each other out or struggling and suffering together in important ways? How can you support and reinforce new cross-cutting connections? Is this a moment where, as leaders who are dealing with this crisis, you're able to build relationships with a new diverse set of leaders that reaches across your community that you might not otherwise be in conversation with? Is this an opportunity to build those relationships by sharing what's working, what you're struggling with, to find ways to mutually support one another? And how can you start to show and tell the stories of these relationships? So we'll pause here. I know it's a lot, but we wanted to give you this sort of broad overview of both risk and sort of key strategies and risks in those strategies to be aware of at this moment in time. Oops. And I'm sorry, I've had some struggles with the PowerPoint deck. So,
yeah, so thank you. I know that's a lot. Luckily, to help ground some of this theory and the strategies we've just presented, there are a number of partners with us today who Anthony introduced at the beginning, and they're going to share with us how they've seen some of these risks playing out, some of the dynamics they've seen playing out in their communities, and also the strategies that they're using or plan to use to counteract these. So we will start with Nichole joining us from Warsaw, Indiana.
Yes, thank you so much, Samantha. Hi, my name is Nichole Rouached, and I work with a pretty interesting organization. We here in Warsaw, Indiana, are the orthopedic capital of the world. So 1/3 of the global market share of orthopedics come from Kosciuszko County. So we have a very large global presence, although are located in rural Indiana. And our organization works around economic development for these corporations. And one aspect of that is the talent, both in developing talent, attracting talent, and retaining talent. So we've long hosted a diversity committee that's gained a lot of traction over the last few years. When I came to our group a few years ago, what I found is a lot of people have heart for inclusive practices and reaching out to some of our other communities that the companies have brought in, most notably our Indian community. Some of our companies contract with Tata out of India. So we have a large Warsaw Indian community. Last year's Diwali event was capped out at about 400 people. So that's pretty big in our area. And we also have a large Latina population, and near us in Fort Wayne, Indiana, we have a large Burmese refugee population that some of the companies have vans come up from to bring talent into the county. So we've long worked with the talent, and people had a heart for this, but not necessarily the tools on how to work within the communities and create a more equitable community. There was a lot of what I call surface level activity and checkbox diversity going on. So we didn't see real integration. We didn't see these groups represented at the leadership tables, or even in sort of the designing of some of the activities for Hispanic Month, for Black History Month, some of those things. And we've seen a lot of growth. And with COVID-19, it's paused a lot of the work that we were doing. We were gaining a lot of momentum. We have elected officials now on our committee. We were discussing doing a statement of welcomeness across the county, and being in rural Indiana that's very politically conservative as well as socially conservative. Billy Graham from the evangelical movement also came out of here. So we have a lot of different interesting dynamics going on. And how do we navigate? We were just getting a handle on navigating these before COVID-19, and this has drastically changed it. Of course, as more immigration policies have rolled out, this is impacting our talent, their perception within the community. So how do we not just we work with these communities, but how do we still get a positive message of one community out when, as Samantha and Rachel have already pointed out, in times of health crisis, we start targeting different groups, right? So this is also kind of set back to that narrative. People start to default to, well, what about the poor white people, and find a reasons not to engage with these different communities that we have here in the area. And so we're still trying to think long-term, but also being a bit slower, I'd say, than a lot of our partners in Welcoming America, seeing a lot of great resources going up. But we don't have one organization that can support and take donations for people without documentation. We don't have one group that's really spreading or able to disseminate information in different languages. So it's a lot of patchwork going on. And I think that networking that they spoke to is a very big part of this, is just using our networks more hidden right now, and then hopefully come up with some campaign that does set a positive norm, both for this pandemic as well as for getting us back on traction with the growth we've been having.
Thank you. I really appreciate. No, it was great. It was great. I really appreciate your perspective, especially doing this work in a rural community. I feel like that is a perspective that is often lacking in these conversations. So thank you for sharing the challenges and also how you're tackling those. So I will, is there anything else you wanted to add before I hand it over?
No, I mean, I'd also like to hear, I saw some from Nebraska and Iowa, if you have any questions or comments, anything else that rural communities are doing, any groups, whether it's United Way or your mayor's office that are taking things on. So I'd like to hear from you guys in the comment section.
Thanks, Nichole. I would love to turn it over to Z, who's joining us from Salt Lake City. Oh, Z, you're on mute. There we go. I thought
I should learn all the lessons with Zoom conferencings by now. 5 weeks into this. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today, and thank you so much for the presentation. Anthony introduced, I am Zeman Xiao, and I direct the Office for New Americans in Salt Lake County, Utah. And a couple of things I want to highlight with with the presentation that is being presented and how that is playing out in Salt Lake County. One I want to focus on is on this narrative piece and stereotype. One of the things that we have seen is that this pandemic has unmasked systemic inequity that we have in the community. We have seen certain communities really being left behind. We have seen that in the numbers. And one of the the things that is coming out of that is that there's this narrative of perception that those communities are left out because they're vulnerable, they are not able to take care of themselves, they're not able to take care of resources. And we really want to shift that narrative to say that it's not the people fault that they're being left out, is that the system we have in place is inequitable. And so when we categorize certain groups as vulnerable population because they're vulnerable, that is coming from a really deficit standpoint, saying that people do not have what they take and they're not able to take care of themselves. So what we have really done is trying to combat that narrative and try to think about how we can approach it from more of a positive standpoint. Instead of calling people vulnerable, let's talk about the assets that they're bringing to a community. For examples, I think that one of the population that's suffering a lot in a community is ethnic small business owners. They're not getting access to resources that is available to them, and there is a lot of advocacy, right? Say how do we bring resources to them that is equitable with the languages that they need, and really meeting people for where they are. So one of the ways that we're doing in this, in advocating for resources, is coming from the standpoint that, look here, if these businesses are not able to survive through this, there's going to be an impact in a community. We're helping them because they are such a big asset in the community, not because they are a deficit in the community. So I think those type of narratives is really important, and I think that it has to come from leadership. It's not the mayor has to, and other leaders in the community really have to stand out and frame that narrative. So that is really important. We're trying our best to really reframe that, trying to not use those negative connotations to categorize the community that we're in. And then the now I lost my train of thought, but I think that is really important for us to understand and be able to reframe that. And so I think it ties really well into the presentation that you have. It's not something that we can address right away. I think that this is something that we've been trying to address for a long time, but we're being a lot more intentional and really speeding up the process.
Thank you. Those are such important points. And I think, yeah, like you say, it ties into what Rachel was saying about metaphors and framing, and just how the way we frame things can feed into a guilt narrative or a dehumanizing narrative that then serves to quote unquote justify negative actions, harmful actions toward targeted groups. So thank you very much. All right, I am going to turn it over to Natalie to share now.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you to Z and Nichole for what you've shared so far. Samantha and Rachel, a lot of what you said is what we are doing here in St. Cloud, Minnesota through Unite Cloud. I founded Unite Cloud 5 years ago and have been the director for those 5 years. Well, actually 5 years old next month, so it's been an amazing journey. I grew up in central Minnesota, and everyone when I grew up in the 80s and 90s looked like me. The biggest difference was Catholic or Lutheran here in this town, and now we really are becoming a very diverse town. We have a lot of Somali refugee and immigrant neighbors who started to move to Minnesota a couple of decades ago and came here as refugees or immigrants. And now we have a majority minority school district for the first time ever. And so we've really had a drastic change in our community. And there's been some folks that have really had a difficult time with that, knowing how to wrap their head around that change. And then also really knowing how to help their neighbors and get to know their neighbors. So Unite Cloud comes onto the scene as a group that helps people know their neighbors, love their neighbors, and stand up for their neighbors. And consistently, we reaffirm the we, like you guys were talking about. And that's really in our language. So when we put out a call for help for someone, we will say, can you help your neighbor out? And everyone that we refer to is our neighbor. And that really levels the playing field. It doesn't matter your religion, your ethnicity. If you've been here for 40 years or 4 years or 4 months, you are us and we are you, and you are our neighbor. It really inclusive language, like when we talk about our American Indian neighbors, we'll say First Nation brothers and sisters, to really, again, say we are together, and what we do impacts you, and what you do affects us, because we're in this together. When we do a lot of stuff on social media. We were started as a social media place hub, and then we grew into a nonprofit. And so when we hashtag things like St. Cloud Proud or Central Minnesota Proud, that includes everybody. And then what we found is people start to see themselves as the we instead of an us and them when they come and really engage in what we're doing. What we found that doesn't work for reaffirming the we is if you reaffirm the we without acknowledging any pain. So if someone says, hey, here's what happened to me at Walmart. I was going in and I was with my little girl, and this has actually happened to one of our members a couple of weeks ago. One woman said, I didn't know that your kind could be out during this pandemic. And this is one of our Asian neighbors. And she had never really experienced this kind of public harassment before. So she thought maybe she was referring to the fact that she had a child with her. Maybe it's because she's a mother. But then she realized, oh no, she's saying that because I'm Asian. So when she tells us that, and when she tells her friends that, and when she goes live on Facebook actually and talks about it, what we see first, that some folks are not really able to gather that empathy for her. They may say, well, that's just one person, don't worry about it. Don't give this a light of day, just promote the good, not the bad. These are interesting things to think about. And of course, we want to know what the good is that's coming in our community and happening. But at the same time, when someone is suffering, to be able to use that empathetic listening, like you guys were talking about, and validate their emotions is really important. Along with that, setting the positive norms, we have signs in our community that we made that say, love your neighbor. And I was telling these folks on our planning call yesterday, we are a suburban area surrounded by rural, mostly conservative folks here. And we needed to have a sign that would resonate with who we're serving. So maybe in a larger metro area, you could have a sign that has rainbows on it and talks about loving all your diverse neighbors, your LGBTQ neighbors. And while I would put that sign in my yard, most people in this area would not. And so our sign that we made, it's red, white, and blue. It says love your neighbor, which is in all religions that are in this area. And when people put that in their yard or on their bumper, then it's kind of it's a norm. It becomes normal, like, oh, they love their neighbor. Well, why are they doing that? And lastly, I'll just say that we really promote actionable steps. So it's great to have empathy. It's great to put a sign in your yard. That's a good actionable step. But what are we actually doing during this time for connection is what we talked about in our last board meeting. So the resource I want to give you is greencardvoices.org. I've actually been trained on a game called Story Stitch. And you can do it over Zoom or you can do it in person, but it really is a connecting tool for small groups. You answer questions like, name a time you felt supported, and I will share that, and then someone could stitch their story. Oh, that reminds me of a time when I felt this. And so it's high level, right? It's not name a time when you experienced racism, because I probably have never experienced that because I'm white. It's really more, where do we find our human connections and how can we utilize empathy to connect even deeper?
Thank you. I love all the examples you shared. I know we talked on our planning call about those signs, and how smart it is to appeal to local values like that, and read the audience, read your room, right? And get people on board by appealing to a value, to an identity that really matters to people. And also what you said about acknowledging pain is really important. So it's not, when stories like this come up, we're not saying, no, that's not, shutting people down and rejecting those stories and saying, no, that's not how it is. That's not how it is. That's not how it is in terms of norm setting, but saying that's not who we aspire to be. That's not what we believe in, but also acknowledging when negative things happen and acknowledging the pain behind those. So thank you. So thank you all so much. Again, it's incredible work, and I'm blown away by it. At this point, I will turn it back to Anthony, who I believe will be leading a Q&A session.
Absolutely, yep. Amazing sharing. Thank you all so much. This has really been an incredible hour. We do have a few minutes left, so we're gonna take some of the questions, as many as we can get to here with the time that remains. A lot of good questions are coming in here, so let's begin. First one from Alexandra, and she's asking, have there been any efforts in any of your cities or local governments where you're creating any sort of, working with them to create some sort of a positive messaging on their websites or social media, any other channels of that sort? Anything that's like more inclusive, and if you've done that, what has that partnership and collaboration looked like? And I'm opening that up to everyone.
I would say that, this is kind of what Nichole talked about, the reality. So if I go to a Welcoming Interactive, the majority of folks there are from larger cities, and they're working directly with their mayors and their city councilmen. We have city councilmen here that want to halt refugee resettlement. And that's kind of the reality of where we're working. So while we do try to partner as best we can with leaders, it's almost like we have to create our own channel. And that's really, our Facebook page is seen as that in this community. We have over 6,000 followers. And that stuff will be shared really all over central Minnesota. But the one thing I will say is we've tried to learn from Minneapolis, St. Paul, and there's a group there called All Are Welcome Here, and they have made a sign and a cling for your window that just says "In This Together," and that's very high level, right? So just to put that on your window or put it in your business, again, it's that flashpoint that, yes, we're in this together. I'm a welcoming place. You can trust me and what's going on here.
It is interesting during this pandemic, our community has actually gotten closer together. I work for Salt Lake County, so I'm in the county level. There's the Salt Lake City and there's the state of Utah. And many of you know Utah is considered pretty conservative. So we had really progressive things happening in the city and the county level, but not statewide. And through this pandemic, I think communities are really coming together. In fact, I can't say anything right now, but there is a press announcement coming up at 1:30. In 30 minutes, awesome, great things that is happening in the state level where the governor is making a statement. So to be shared later on.
And I'll say, right before this came on, we had been having discussions on pronouns and inclusive language. What does that look like? And so again, we've had to step back. What does that mean in this reality? And I want to go back to one thing Zaz said earlier, in terms of where we were. Some of our neighbors joke that our area is about 10 to 15 years behind the school district north of us or the county north of us or so forth. So for us, we've really had to, there's a lot of a colorblind approach into the work we're doing around inclusion. And so you tend to then neglect both the positive and you know, as I said, deficit attributes that are associated with community, some of it real, a lot of it not, but nevertheless, there wasn't that recognition. And so right now it's even more important to come together, but then also recognize the realities and the strengths that a lot of communities can bring. Our Spanish speaking churches are doing phenomenal things, and it's just connecting them with resources. Again, this is kind of just happening through connections and internally in companies. And we're hoping maybe next month to be doing some more public facing things to support our community.
Amazing. And I wanted to share really quickly, one of our attendees just entered something. Brittany, thank you for sharing this. Somewhat related to this and kind of changing the language that we're using. And she shared that in their community, they're encouraging the political leadership to de-emphasize the language around the use of the words like citizen and changing that to words like residents or neighbors, which again is really talking, yeah, Natalie's got the thumbs up, really talking to, you know, what we're trying to do here. And I think that's a really great way to start that. We are unfortunately coming up on end of time here, and I think we could certainly keep going. This has obviously been a topic that is very important to many of us. And I know, Rachel, I think you wanted to mention something about a resource before we close up.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna let everyone know, I mean, we have been creating, it's pretty simple, it's a Google Doc. It is a much more comprehensive version of what we just shared, and we'll be sharing it out with different partners we've worked with over the last couple of years, and we're quite happy we'll make it available to this group as well.
Wonderful, thank you so much. All right, before we close out, anyone have any closing thoughts or anything that you'd like to share?
I just wanted to thank Samantha and Rachel for their important work. It really makes me as a welcomer and us that are doing welcoming work here feel like, oh, wow, I'm doing some things that actually are best practices. So thanks for being able to share this with us, and thanks, Anthony, for making this happen.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I know I can say on behalf of everyone at Welcoming America, we're just very grateful for all of you for sharing your time today. We know all of you are super busy with regular day-to-day things that are going on. So Samantha, Rachel, Nichole, Z, Natalie, thank you all so much for sharing the time today. Also want to thank all of you, our attendees, for sharing this hour with us. Just wanted to also make you aware of a couple of other things that we are offering to all of our members here. So on your screen now, you should see mention of the Inclusive Emergency Management Community of Practice. And they are a partner working with us here at Welcoming America. They're extending an opportunity to members to discuss foundational principles, innovations, challenges, and solutions for organizations working to ensure immigrants can access and contribute to COVID-19 prevention, care, resources, and response coordination. So that launch is coming up in early May, and the deadline to sign up for that is April 28th. So coming up next week. So you're going to want to look more into that pretty soon. And then in addition, another partner of ours, Global Wordsmiths, is working with us. We're going to be offering some weekly workshops and one-on-one coaching on language access with them. So the topics on that are going to change every week. First session is going to come up pretty quickly here on April 27th on Monday. So for both of those items, if you want to learn more and try to get in there and sign up, invite you to go to our fairly new Resilient Rapid Response page that you can find on our website. And it's also right there with our COVID-19 resources page. So a lot of information there, not only from our partners, but a lot of you, our members, that are sharing so wonderfully. We really do appreciate that. So again, reminder, this webinar today is being recorded, and we'll share out a link to that recording so you can go back and listen to all of this information again. If you have any other questions related to today's topic or something else, feel free to shoot an email over to events@welcomingamerica.org, and we will get get those responses answered for you. Or if you have any ideas for topics, feel free to share that as well. So really, again, appreciate everyone sharing and sharing their time with us today. Again, a thank you to all of our speakers and to all of you for joining us. We will see you again, hopefully, on our next webinar. In the meantime, stay well and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.